This game by Anatoly Karpov is a great example of how white should play on the white side of the Maroczy bind. This position can also arise by transposition from the accelerated dragon in the Sicilian defense. And in this game, black chooses knight takes d4, which forces white to take on d4 with the queen. In this structure, it is very typical for white to play rook to c1, especially after black has played bishop to e6, attacking the c4 pawn. White defends the e4 pawn and frees up the knight on c3 to move. Black is preparing counterplay on the queen side with pawn to b5, and for this reason white tries to exchange the queens, because that would make more difficult for black to play b5. So white chooses to move the knight to a4, not to d5, which would appear to be more natural. But the analysis would show that if white had played knight to d5, then black would take on d2 and then take on d5 with the knight, and it's really dangerous to take the e7 pawn. So white really wants to wait till he puts the knight on d5, and for now he is aiming at the b6 square, which has been weakened by a6. Black exchanges queens, although sometimes it's also possible to play queen to d8 and keep the queens on the board. Here black has to guard the b6 square, and currently the main line is knight to d7. The idea is that it's bad for white to take on e7, because then bishop to h6 is going to win the exchange. But this was the first game where this position happened, so Kavalek defended b6 with the other natural move, rook to c6. So in this situation white comes back and ends up playing knight d5 anyway. The idea is that in this particular position black can no longer take with the knight, because then white can just take with the e pawn and fork the rook on c6 and the bishop on e6. So white's kind of exploiting the fact that the rook on c6 isn't placed very well. While black has been kind of busy guarding the b6 square, white begins the pawn offensive on the king side, and the game shows very well what kind of problems black is facing in this pawn structure. It's generally been quite difficult for black to tolerate this strong knight on d5, so he exchanges the bishop on d5 and hoping that he can hold the position. But white has the spatial advantage, two bishops, so he has a pretty long-term initiative in this pawn structure. Naturally Karpov takes with the e-pawn. This way he will have some pressure on the e-file, he will keep rooks on the board for a bit longer, so this is definitely the better way to capture on d5. In the game black really couldn't find any decent plan, so he just started to waste time going back and forth with the pieces. Karpov suggests that maybe instead black should have played something like rook e8 and pawn to e6. White's naturally better in this position, but black doesn't have any weaknesses, so it's going to be pretty difficult for white to win. With bishop to g4, Karpov wants to provoke black to play pawn to f5, which would create weaknesses on the king side and allow white to open up files later with, say, pawn to g4. So black is putting pressure on the c4 pawn, and it's not good for white to take on b5, because then black can play something like rook to c3. White has to make an important strategic decision to take with a pawn or to take with the rook. And basically, if he takes with the rook, then that rook is going to be exchanged, and there's going to be only one pair of rooks on the board. If he takes with a pawn, then all the rooks are going to stay on the board. So which one is better? So this is the correct way to take on c4, because white wants to reduce the pressure that black can exert on the queen side, and with only one pair of rooks on the board, it's going to be hard for black to create counterplay on the queen side, even though he still manages to create some. With this exchange on c5, we're gonna get bishops of opposite color on the board, and Karpov correctly judged that the initiative he has on the king side, where he's advancing the pawns, is going to give him good winning chances, even though generally bishops of opposite colors can lead to a draw. In a couple of his books, Mark Dvoretsky analyzed this position in some great detail. He showed that white should have played pawn to g5, completely shut down the black bishop, allow the black rook to get a little bit active, and even win the pawn, but play against that really horrible bishop on f8. Instead, he decided to first deal with the threat of rook to a5, and not play g5 just yet. But g5 right now was probably the most accurate move. So now at least the bishop on f8 is doing something by putting pressure on the pawn on h6. But still, of course, white's pieces are much more active, so he's much better here. Black decides to activate the king, but that leads to the loss of the h7 pawn, because the bishop manages to penetrate to g8. So white has a very dangerous passed pawn on h7, and black has a couple of ways of dealing with it. He basically can take on c4 with check first, or he can play bishop g7 immediately. In the game he played bishop g7. It was a bit better to take on c4 first, but his position probably still remained quite difficult. So now white has the extra pawn. His pieces are very well placed, and the pawn on h7 is very dangerous. So white doesn't have a very difficult time winning this position. So here black is in a bit of a zugzwang. The rook has to guard the e-file so that white doesn't play bishop to e4. The bishop has to stay on h7, on h8, so that white doesn't advance the pawn, and the king has to stay on f5 so that the white king doesn't advance to g4. So black doesn't really have very many good moves, and that's why he loses quite fast here. One of the problems in black's position is that in addition to his pieces being placed very passively, he also has 3 isolated pawns. So while black is all tied up, white just starts to attack them one by one, and turns out that g6 is pretty hard to defend. Again, black is in zugzwang. If he moves the king to f7, and the white just advances the king to g5, and then the g6 pawn is going to be lost. So black resigned here. A very instructive game by Karpov, where he gradually built up the advantage, and exploiting his 2 bishops, started to advance pawns on the king side, gradually provoking some weaknesses. Then he advanced the pawns to the extent that they would limit the black bishop, and then he created the passed pawn on h7 and ended up winning the game. Overall, despite the fact that this game was played a very long time ago in 1974, it's still an example of how white should play against the accelerated dragon.